Well, the protests are continuing in Iraq this week, and it looks like they've burned another Iranian consulate. I don't know if this has happened only once before, or maybe twice, but I remember the consulate in Basra has been burned at least once. And there might have been one other case in which they burned down an Iranian consulate, but this time it was not in Basra, it was in Najaf, I believe how you say that, which is apparently a very important holy city for the Shi'ites. Who of course are the majority in Iraq and also happen to be the sect that shares a religion with Iran. These are the people who, historically have been understood as, somewhat allies to Iran, because they've, for most of the history, well, actually all of the history of modern Iraq, since the Iraqi state as we know it was created after World War I, they've been under Sunni domination, and before then even they were under Sunni domination by the Ottomans, and going back into the mists of history, the very I believe it was the Abbasid Caliphate. They were based out of Baghdad, and centered in Mesopotamia. So there's a very long lineage of Sunni rule in Iraq that has given that has led, conventional wisdom would dictate the Shiites of the country to identify a lot with the Iranians as sort of the big Shiite Muslim power in the Near East. But now it seems that this younger generation that's been engaging in all these protests, they are not fans of the Iranians. They have apparently, developed a bit of a distaste. The older generation of Shiites who run the Iraqi government since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, many of them were in exile for 30 years or so in Iran. And so many of the younger folks apparently feel that this older generation, they're kind of like foreign agents. They see them as people who are, not fully Iraqi, but to some extent assimilated into Iran, and they are definitely a part of Iran's sphere of influence. And one of the big points of this whole protest movement, not just in Najaf, but broadly across Iraq, has been this distaste for foreign influence in the country, both American and Iranian. These people really, I guess you could say, want to put Iraq first. And who can blame them? This is a country that has, since 2003, been the site of, two bigger powers around them jockeying for power, that being, the U.S. and Iran. And Iran certainly has gotten the upper hand in influencing Iraq. And to anyone who didn't already think that was the case, I think that these leaked cables that came from inside the Iraqi government that were given to WikiLeaks, to The Intercept, and then shared with the New York Times that were published recently, I think that should have convinced you pretty well that the Iranians have won the upper hand there in terms of gaining influence over the government. So I don't think the protesters are at all out of line for complaining that their government is beholden to foreign powers, like Iran and the United States. The U.S., of course, the U.S. influence being much more obvious and sort of in your face because the U.S. has troops there and has been, on or off at various stages of war in that country for, a decade and a half. Back to the Iranians, though, the current government that's in Iraq that, is the target of all these protests, they've been apparently consulting with the Iranian government, be it Rouhani and the Ayatollah and what have you, all those folks, and they've been encouraging them to take a pretty hard line against the protesters and to, not go so soft on them, don't try and appease them, and that, appeasement, the Iranians feel, is not a good strategy for the folks in Iraq. For the current government in power, and this is a lot of reports coming out about that, in the Arab press about the under the or I guess back channel talks. Although I'm sure it's direct, they're direct talks, but secret talks, not public. They're not tweeting at each other on the internet between the Iranian and Iraqi governments. And this, of course, to the protesters is just more evidence of Iran's sway over the Iraqi government. They're treating them sort of like their child, like daddy helping a son navigate through some legal trouble. And of course, they're doing that to the benefit of the government and not the protesters. So the protesters are quite mad because, they look at what the Iranians are telling their government, and they're thinking that, hey, in the absence of Iranian influence here, we probably would have made more progress getting our government to compromise and to try to appease some of our demands. And so all these things, I'm sure, are what contributed to the furor amongst the rioters who burned down the Iranian Consulate in Najaf last night or today. Now, apparently nobody was injured, and the protesters couldn't even storm the consulate. The Iraqi troops pushed them back, but people were able to. A few stragglers were able to get up there and pull down the Iranian flag and hoist an Iraqi flag and set fire to the building, even though they're really, it wasn't completely ransacked or anything. Now, the Iraqi troops they weren't able to completely protect the building since it burned down, but they were able to keep most of the protesters out of the building, and they did that by opening fire on the largely unarmed crowd. Now, these people were quite rambunctious and violent in that they were about to, storm a foreign consulate, which is a big no-no, and try and destroy the building. However, it doesn't look good when you are having to shoot a bunch of your own citizens. From the standpoint of a government, if you're having to do that, you're probably not doing too well. So after the dust settled, apparently 24 people were killed in this incident in Najaf, and dozens more, I'm sure, injured and clinging to life in hospitals. They were probably pumped full of 7.62 by 3.9 rounds, which, what's that, like 140 some odd grains going through your body. That's not going to feel too good. And so that's a pretty huge, death count for a democratically elected government to rack up. And of course, there have been incidents like this ever since the October protests started. Of course, now we're almost to the end of November, and there have been, quite a few incidents with double-digit death counts. And so the death count is, I haven't checked exactly, but I'm pretty sure it's into the hundreds by now. And things are showing, no sign of letting up. The government's not really looking to compromise. They're being pressured by the Iranians to stand their ground, and I just see things getting worse and worse. And the U.S. at this point, since the government in Baghdad is, pretty well aligned with Tehran, I don't think that the U.S. even would mind that badly if the government was overthrown by the protest movement. The government that the U.S. installed stupidly, and against their own interests, replacing, Saddam Hussein, an enemy of Iran, with an ally of Iran. I mean, it's kind of imperialism 101 that you try and, ally with the enemies of your enemy, and, you don't want to help the allies of your enemy. But hey, maybe I'm just a better imperialist than George W. Bush. Speaking of which, the Iranians have gone further than to say that the U.S. wouldn't mind if this government was overthrown. They think that the U.S. is, and the CIA are behind this whole protest movement, which, I wouldn't put it past the CIA. I mean, it seems a little early to turn on the Iraqi government, considering that, they've only been supporting them for a few years, but as far as I'm concerned, I think that this government would crumble anyway, as long as, as soon as the U.S. withdrew its support. They don't even necessarily have to affirmatively help the protest movement, but, it's not out of the question. And, of course, Iran says they've arrested some CIA guys now and whatever. So, you never know about this stuff at the time. You can only gauge, to what extent the CIA has motive to act. And I really think that it could go either way here. It could just be that they've removed their support. And, a weak government like this without a lot of external support is going to fall naturally. I think this little experiment in Iraqi democracy was ill-fated from the very beginning. So I guess I'll just continue to watch it unravel from here, the safety of my home, far away from the Middle East. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.